Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today, once again, I have the pleasure of welcoming Anastasia Volkova, the CEO and founder of Regrow Ag, to the podcast. Anastasia's joining us to discuss the journey she's taken with Regrow in driving the uptake and adoption of regenerative agriculture, both from this perspective of the corporates who see this as an opportunity to reduce their scope 3 profiles, as well as the challenges of implementing these practices in a profitable and sustainable way across the thousands and thousands of farmers and ranchers across the globe. Anastasia, thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here.
So you have been a leader and an advocate in the regenerative agriculture space for a long time, one of the early leaders in that space. And in light of the recent declaration by 40 leading global food and ag companies to support regenerative agriculture, how have you seen this, the thinking and the implementation or the adoption of regenerative agriculture change over recent years? And where's there been great progress and what still needs to be done?
That's a great question, Ash. So I see a couple of different important context pieces to put in place for our discussion. So you're asking, how do things change over the last 10 years? I would say that there is data to show what actually is happening on the ground. And we were sharing with some of our community in the local meeting in the Midwest region where we operate. We operate globally, but in that region specifically, that we're seeing the adoption sliding backwards in the Midwest right now. So whilst many people might be thinking, okay, we might have slowed down, we might not be as aggressive on the adoption, but we are still moving in the right direction. Actually, the data, so satellite imagery processed with our Gen AI models and through our biogeochemical models that helps us understand what the practices are on the ground and then understand the outputs of those practices and the impact on the environment. The practice piece is going backwards. So there's less cover cropping, less conservation tillage adoption than there was previously within the same decade. Sometimes, in terms of different states, it could be a single-digit movement, but actually, in more places than not, is low double digits, so tens of percentage points. There are, of course, help spots where the adoption is doing really well, and we're diving in the communities there to understand what are they doing that is keeping them moving in the right direction, retaining the practices, and continue to build on it. So this is what I see from our data set covering almost 1.5 billion acres globally, so more than 52% arable land. This is specifically diving into the US market. The data set obviously shows very different things for other markets. But this is a leading market that underwent a lot of change in the last 3 years. We were first in the height of the investment with climate smart practices within the IRA bill of those $3.8 billion dollars. And we have now seen part of that funding being replaced in the US with the regenerative pilot program that's 700 million. And it also has certain parameters that might enable the producer, might not enable the producer to actually undertake the transition. If they need to enroll the full farm, that can be challenging because some of the food programs can only be paying for specific crops in rotation. And so this confluence of factors, just looking at the US, I'm sure we'll have time to look at other markets because they behave very differently. This confluence of factors makes me draw the following arc. We were in a place of evangelizing, and that was a very important place. That place had its own challenges, like common nomenclature, like understanding what we were referring to. We've moved from evangelizing to investing in the second part of that period. And what we've seen over the last 3 years is really a lot of investments going into the ground, co-invested with government programs, co-invested with supply chain partners, co-investment, co-investment, co-investment. Very important to unlock dollars if company wants to put in dollars. That's what activates capital. Now we are in a some might say tougher spot, but it's a different context, from the funding environment and from political, geopolitical environment, supply chain environment. There is the need to, I would use a SaaS analogy here, to make it repeatable. So if we move from evangelizing to needing to make it repeatable in completely different conditions, and this is where I have some thoughts on what we might do, but I'm a little nervous that we haven't solved for it yet, and we can't just, take our hands off the wheel and let the car drive itself.
Okay, that's fascinating. There's a lot of stuff going on there. There's the fact that government funding has greatly changed, but there's also the fact that things like food, fertilizer and diesel costs have gone up, and both of those seem to be pushing in different directions. And I imagine there's a lot that can be learnt when you really, really dig into that data.
Absolutely. Like if you want to look at the farm level, the increased diesel prices and increased fertilizer prices are really squeezing the farmer because the commodity markets are not performing really well. It's this kind of post-tariff state that is changed. And there is the added inflation that food companies are accounting for, where it's pulling some of their resources away. So what I'm seeing so far is that we are in this new make it repeatable stage, and this comes from SASTER framework by Jason Lemkin, for anyone interested. But in this stage, I think we're keeping the investment that we had before when I'm looking at the main sponsors of the programs that excite the transition, that ignite the transition, so the food brands and the manufacturers. We are seeing slowly more entities come to the table because we're certainly realizing that that co-investment is not coming right now from the government. So can it come from other parts of the value chain, of other supporting systems? Can it come maybe not from federal, but from local government? Can it come from some additional incentives from the bank and insurance? And of course, we've been talking about it, but I think now that we're seeing like irrigation water restrictions in Nebraska, we're seeing that really hitting the farmers, and farmers taking a prevent plant payment instead of the farming that land. That's a real natural resource constraint resulting in a planting decision that further exacerbates just the food security nationally. And there's a lot more national thinking that has been um, starting to percolate, and then maybe there was more global thinking before. So I would say we are seeing farmers being in a tough spot, food companies being in a tough spot, and we're yet all trying to figure out as a system together, as a community together, the industry that believes in the fact that region ag is necessary for us to get to the benefits of the conservation on the other side, to be able to withstand the climate shocks, to be able to steadily produce good yields. We're seeing the opposites of that in the news, and that's important to prove the point why we should all align on conservation. So I think there's more work for us to form maybe unexpected alliances, maybe bring more allies on board with the conservation to unlock more funding there.
On that note, you mentioned some thoughts you had, and especially around what you just said about the, unconventional allies and bringing them together. What are you able to share in terms of your thoughts on how to move this forward? Because especially that transition from government money for that evangelist stage to the sustainable stage, which will not be, or scalable stage, which will not be, can't be reliant, for a long term on that government, on those government dollars.
Absolutely. So I think we're looking to attract more public funding in different shapes and forms. So maybe there's other funding programs that are not these wholesale that start new, but actually more regionally accessible programs, maybe like the RPP one that is still aligned with an RCS equip for the US, where we can bring that funding along. What about novel instruments? Is it warranties to pay for any yield gaps for those farmers that are more conservative further down the adoption curve? Is it figuring out other co-benefits? Because we are actively working on that as well. Regrow is able to estimate the water quality outputs for its regenerative agriculture programs that are on Regrow MRV, but we do not necessarily have a clear market there from companies aligning on the standard and saying this is exactly what I need, this is our internal ambition, this is what we're trying to do in protecting water resources. And water is valued in point trading opportunities and municipal level, and will no doubt continue to be the constraining resource for the agricultural production. So this is what I see in the US specifically. Now, if we look to Europe, for example, we are seeing the continued co-investment from the government. There's continued subsidy. There's also interest. The team was participating in the CRCF days. It's a framework for carbon removal certification, and it's being stood up by the European Union, where they are looking to combine effectively a way for private industry to come together with public funding to compensate farmers for additional outcomes of the transition beyond what the basic subsidies do. And we see also in places like Europe, where there's a very diversified rotation of the crops, the need for more coalitions. It's the word that I've been hearing more than any other word in the last 6 months, because I believe it's code word for cost sharing and co-investment that otherwise, the programs would not pass the investment review unless you're able to unlock additional dollars. So we all need to be thinking about who are those partners, how can we contribute, how can we cost share. And I also don't want to be sitting here pointing fingers in every direction. At Regrow, we've been working very hard to ensure longevity of our own business and to lower the costs. And I am pretty proud of what team has been able to achieve with affordability of our solution and diversification as well. We have performed the acquisition of Latin American MRV, Puma, Plataforma Puma, and that brings in-house a wider range of MRV options as well. That literally leads me to my to answering your first question. They are supporting SAI Regenerate Together framework that we're seeing European and Latin American markets aligned to. And this is what supports lower costs of MRV that leaves more money to the farmer. So I think we're all doing the right things, but we have to be doing them. This is where the hard work is. We're no longer going after the biggest fruit in the garden. We're picking all the fruit, medium size, small, everything we can get all together.
There's a lot there as well. I think there's one of the things that's come up frequently is the importance of getting the capital to pay for all this. And if we take a step back and you think that what the I guess natural services or the natural nature's contribution to our food system, which everyone has taken for granted as basically being free for the last 100 or so, or 10,000 years, whichever metric you wish to choose, and now that bill needs to be somehow paid. And we've got this system where everyone's used to the cost structures from the consumer all the way back up to the farmer. And we need to find these extra dollars because if we do want to grow food sustainably, it may be more expensive than uh, growing it the way we've grown it over the last 50 years. So it's mobilizing those dollars and how that is where who pays for what all the way from the consumer all the way up the chain, and then there's also looking outside the financial side of things and what's motivating the farmers aside from the financial aspects, or is this all a financial driver? Because I think in my thinking, we've been talking about climate change and need for change, but it's always come back to who's got to pay for it. So where's the balance between the need for the money and just if we just accept that that's the main requirement, um, or is there other things that we need to include?
Absolutely. Ash, I'm reading in your question something I fundamentally agree with. There's also this question like, what is the money needed for, and what is the money going towards? Like, what are, as my friend and mentor recently said, the energies we're working here. There's already an energy in that system. Where's that energy going? Because nothing, from the physics perspective, ever gets created or ceases. It changes its state. So, what is the energy we're trying to maybe divert? Maybe change the course of to bring it into the funding of this transition. I do see in my mind it's somehow pretty clear that we are paying for the lack of the transition in arrears from the perspective of insurance and effectively handouts to farmers. We could be assuring the system as opposed to ensuring it. And what I mean by that is when there's failures from climate disasters, when there is now desire to not plant because there's no irrigation water, and it's perfectly sensible economic and farm management decision, that all points to natural resources constraint that are a public good. And if we're looking at that public good, it's the crop insurance that is currently not motivating the transition. It is additional subsidies that are more on um, spot-based events that go out. Those are incredible sums of money compared to the private industry capital put into this. And we're aware that it's also hundreds of millions of dollars that some of the companies are putting into it. But by and large, the program budgets are much smaller. And all combined, I believe they're still smaller than that crop insurance budget that is currently not motivating the resilience of the system, but is motivating the existing entrenched structure that was optimized to ensure that the industry could scale to feed the world because we were dealing with other challenges. Now we're dealing with the combined challenge of continuing to need to feed the world. And some might disagree because I said that because we actually are wasting a lot of food. So maybe we already grow enough. But anyhow, we're not going to stop needing to feed people. We continue to have a need for productivity in the system. And additionally, for that to be sustainable, we need it to be nature forward. So I do think that capital is what's on everyone's mind. It's not necessarily net new capital, is how I think it needs to be seen. It needs to be seen as an exchange of the capital that either will be spent in the future or was spent in the past. And what I'm hearing from our community of customers and their supply chain partners is that when a company has had the experience with an ingredient price increase due to a climate disaster, it's easier for them to have that internal knowing at the leadership team level that there is a need to invest in their supply chains. Of course, individual companies cannot get there alone because if we sum up all of the food industry's demand globally, that's not all of the acres. And if we just have the food system rather than, say, animal agriculture, there's a lot of land, majority, that we're using for even animals and even the fuel stocks. So how much is the food? Is it 10%, 15%, 20% based on the country? Some countries maybe more. So we definitely need some system-wide changes where those other pieces need to come along as well.
A lot of what you're mentioning links very directly into government policy. And if we think back 100 years, give or take, in the Dust Bowl and the crop insurance program, I think it was President Roosevelt and the land grant university system and all these things that have kind of got us to where we are today were very innovative at the time, and they've been hugely successful when they were implemented post such a
Mhm.
huge shock and such a huge impact on food security and food production as the Dust Bowl was. And I guess my concern is, do we need to have, that punch in the face, for want of a better term, to get us to act? And what you said about the different companies, it's almost like if they have been punched in the face, for want of a better acronym, they react, and until they have, they seem to, bury their head in the sand.
I cannot disagree. I think nothing teaches us better than direct experience of having the shock and having to respond to the shock. I think we're seeing diff other behaviors in other markets. In Europe, we're seeing a forward-looking, very socialist leaning protection of public good. They're trying in a democratic process to figure out how to do it and command them on it. We're seeing in Asia, the governments of Singapore and Japan are so committed to this transition that they are stimulating the local sector. They are investing in other countries' efforts to mitigate their methane emissions from rice systems and effectively help assure some of the supply chains locally through those supporting investments. So I think ultimately, the resource constraint is something that farmers are extremely experienced with. In those situations where they don't have any other way of producing food, they are transitioning, and areas where it's still a little bit unclear how the environmental benefits of producing with more conservation practice compared to conventional pan out for them in their own profit and loss statement. This is where maybe we're lacking the transition, where we have more of the resource abundance in some cases, or where we are seeing complete lack of capital for the transition. Say they need a more efficient irrigation infrastructure, and that requires capital, as an example. So I think there's different ways and different cultures look at it differently. But if you are looking at capitalistic private market structure that is looking to private businesses to lead, it's that P&L impact that would encourage them to put the investment forward and be able to justify it to their shareholders.
We've mentioned Europe, we've mentioned and discussed the US quite broadly. What about other parts of the world? How you said it was quite different in different parts of the world. How are things playing out elsewhere?
What we're seeing, which is also why we've signed this partnership with Plataforma Puma, is that the Latin American market is rapidly catching up to European import control requirements and the desire to not just ensure that there's no deforestation, but to go beyond and look at how sustainable those commodities are. What are the emissions of those ingredients that they're buying? How can it be ensured that those commodities can be produced in those regions for the years to come as well? And so we are seeing maybe with US as a trading partner changing its stance, a lot of additional energy of international companies is going towards the trade flows between Latin America and Europe, or into just the Latin American region. And this is where we see the alignment broadly for the declaration signed in support of SAI, Regenerate Together framework. I keep saying that food companies who haven't joined yet should definitely take a look and join, because that alignment is just wonderful for everybody in the system. You have the reporting alignment, the data collection alignment, the impact alignment, and their context analysis is also fantastic, where you look at areas and what you would um, be facing as risks and what practices would be able to mitigate those risks. So when we look from that lens in Latin America, we are seeing it's not, of course, a one country, Latin and Central America. You have Brazil, that's its own little universe. And we have Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Chile and others. Um, we are finding that when we have the ability now to operate in these different countries, of course, the livestock systems are very centered there. There's a lot of integration between crop and livestock systems. There is interest to drive the transition on both of those fronts. And hats off to all the Brazilian innovators. There's definitely just so much interest. They've been transitioning to more biological inputs. The vertically integrated agro holdings in Brazil have been pioneers on a lot of different levels of technology, vertical integrated farming, tractors, some of these NASA-like dashboards of their farms. So I think in that region, we will see a lot of innovation out of Argentina, out of Brazil, and out of neighboring countries. The dynamics continue to be pretty complex on the trade. Sometimes one country is rising in terms of exports, sometimes it's the other. But I definitely encourage people to, if you are looking at the region ag transition around the world, pay dedicated, separate attention to that region because it's unlike any other. And they've already adopted a lot of the no-till practices in the region, but what more they can do, they're really looking at diversified rotation, cover cropping in many cases, and better inputs. So just like in Canada, we can look to them, look to Australians, and see, okay, in this different form factor, what was the transition, and what does this mean for other areas that would need to transition?
With Brazil, they in the last 50 or so years, they've gone from a net food importer to one of the world's largest food exporters. And obviously there's many factors involved in that, but one is the role of Embrapa and how they have sent students to world leading universities to educate them and brought that knowledge back to Brazil. Um, and that's not a overnight success. That's a 30 or 40 or 50 year success that they've done there. How important do you think that foundation is in terms of the transitions that they're currently going through? And I guess what do other regions, say Africa or parts of Asia, what could they learn from the Brazilian approach?
Yeah, it's a brilliant observation. I love how historically grounded our conversations are because you're leading them. Um, I would say that we see that everywhere around the world, right? You see that in Australia, you see that in the US, you see it in Europe, everywhere there is a high research investment. It takes decades, but it does result in better crop varietals, better adjusted farming practices to local conditions, better guidance. You've mentioned land grant universities before. Um, the importance of the conservation extension agents in every location around the world is impossible to underscore enough because they are critical to this transition and they are definitely not getting enough funding. Some companies are making priority to fund it, to fund them specifically, but we're seeing again. US federal funding, for example, being rescinded from them. So when we look at the opposite approach of continuing to invest in research, continuing to invest in extension, importantly, after the research of R&D and E, because without the E, the R&D, you don't go anywhere. I think that platform is one of the most important platforms. We are very lucky to have partnered with Embrapa to actually implement our model locally and for them to be our partner in extended calibration for each of the regions. And just the wealth of knowledge and the investment that they have put into place to um, generate this data. It doesn't just fall from the sky on you. If you're talking about longitudinal soil carbon studies with all the different types of treatments and practices on all the different soil types and all the different crop rotation systems, an incredible amount of investment. And we are very glad that they're co-investing with us to calibrate the model for the region to make sure that this is a world-class system that connects natively to um, effectively this way of recognizing the farmers and claiming the impact, of recognizing the impact on the corporate balance sheets or on the supply chain balance sheet. They bought into that idea because they have that science backbone and they see that that's being used in other regions. They want to join that level of export assuredness. Not only it comes with good product, but it also comes with all of those impact numbers, if we may, and all of the verification, validation around it that's needed. I think that's very um, forward-looking of them, and you can see that you cannot really cut your way into success, as my other friend says. You can only invest your way to growth and to success. So, yeah.
On the MRV and the scaling MRV side of things, it's, if you think of the Human Genome Program, when they first mapped the human genome, it cost billions and billions of dollars and took decades. And now you can get a genomic sample done for under $100. But you are never going to make that step in one big jump. It just doesn't work that way. So you've got this need, and you've mentioned that you are looking at, readjusting, and your team's worked very hard and been very and to get your costs down so you can provide a better service to farmers and to the industry. But how do you? It's a very difficult bridge because people say, "Oh, the MRV is too expensive," but when it's in that early stage, you're never going to get it down to the price without going through a few steps along the way. So how have you navigated that, and what do you think is needed more broadly to get other critical MRV systems to that level where it's at that commercial affordability stage?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, given it's my lived experience, and I'm really happy to share it. That first, when we started, it's true that the innovative customers that have seen the opportunity, they've supported us, and they've made pre-commitments at scale that this would make sense to them at that level. And over time, we saw there was a need for more and more capital to move to farmers and more uncertainty control and decreasing the uncertainty of the estimate. So you need to simultaneously keep investing and improving the model to a certain extent, so that you can reduce the uncertainty and make the greatest payout possible to the farmer. So all the incentives are aligned there. We never built the company in order to enrich ourselves and keep raising our prices. This is definitely not the point. The point is to become this almost invisible, present, trusted layer of validation of that impact, and to provide the information where the impact is needed, how that leads to de-risking and resilience of supply chains. So the way that you tap your card now, not even thinking what NFC technology is or was, and there's probably a square logo on the white tablet that buzzes back, and you are not even thinking that there's probably part of the transaction that the vendor is paying to make sure that it's a trusted transaction. So I believe still in the fact that the world of agriculture and food production, the industry, will continue to need the trusted information to transact between the natural capital and the financial capital, to ensure supply chains. I also believe that this is important for the transition. So hopefully one day this problem will be solved and you wouldn't be asking a question. You would just be saying, oh, conservation is a standard now. For this region, I expect this standard of conservation, and this is what I'm getting. Otherwise, maybe I'm not even buying from the supplier, or otherwise, that supplier doesn't even exist anymore because we've already transitioned. Because otherwise, it's impossible to get insurance, it's impossible to get other things. So we're in this new state. Now, to your question of how do you navigate that cost reduction and how can you bring other systems into it? Because the MRV technology now is being applied, and I'm very, very glad that that's the case because we were really fighting to establish this category so hard. You've seen this. Now, MRV is referred to more broadly, not as just a digital system where you enroll farmers into Regen Ag, but anything and almost every technology that can be used to understand that environmental impact, whether it's on soil or on animals or on other aspects of the ecosystem, which is great. Usually it's one of the letters, not all three. Maybe measurement or monitoring or reporting or verification. In some cases, it's all of them. The way that we've done it is with the industry support of these commitments that we were able to amass. I would also say that we are in the moment in time for the row cropping industry, for the croppers. We'll talk separately about livestock. That the capital is a bigger bottleneck than the lack of alignment on MRV. And I think this SAI 40 companies signing the declaration is almost like a heralding moment for that. It's like, okay, great, like we've done this. And I'm sure there's more companies that will join that. And kudos to them. They've done that. I've done nothing about it. So that's fabulous. But I think MRV now is becoming something that people can expect, can talk about, can almost assume. And it is very cost effective. If anyone says MRV is expensive, I suggest you ask them what is the volume they're talking about, because it's probably less than 5,000 hectares. And if that's actually what they're talking about, then maybe MRV needs to be expensive because it's a tiny, tiny, tiny level of impact. And in some supply chains, that's all that's being sourced, and that represents 500 farmers. That's not lost on me. We have projects in Vietnam and in India and in other places where it's tiny, tiny holdings. But what you do in that case is you aggregate, you work with the community aggregators, you work with cooperatives to make sure that if you're deploying digital technology, it can be deployed efficiently, because at that starting off volume or level of commitment, it's true that the price can be high, but I think we're so far beyond that at this point. And so when we're looking at livestock now, there is still a need for some additional foundational investment. R&D community is apparently going to be coming out soon with some additional data sets that we're very excited to support the commercialization of, or work with whoever does that. Because you still need to move through not just what we know about the enteric fermentation and feed regimes, not just what we know about AMP grazing, but actually, can you estimate the changes in pasture soils from the paddock-based AMP grazing, or can you not? Can you scale that, or do you have to sample it? Because if you have to sample everything, and that becomes half of the project budget, that's a non-feasible starting proposition. If you still have to do that, but you're confident and next time you sample, you will be able to model and then scale from there, so it's more cost effective. I can see the same path for that space, and we're actively involved. And I think the livestock industry is very interested in continuing to support that direction.
On the livestock side of things, some recent episodes with Matt Wilson from West Virginia University and Troy Rowan from University of Tennessee, they talked about feed and feed conversion efficiency, and Troy Rowan actually, said that when researchers first put cows into boxes back in the 1950s and 1960s, they weren't interested in monitoring their emissions for the climate. They were interested in monitoring their emissions to understand the animal's metabolism and how effectively they convert pasture or feed into production. And that science is still very, very relevant today. And so they're focusing on that space to try and use the methane as a way of identifying the most feed efficient animals and then aligning that with genetic selection, and the climate's a secondary benefit, with productivity being the first benefit. Um, how do you see that kind of approach in terms of trying to, rather than have a headwind and tailwind, trying to find two tailwinds to help in drive adoption?
It's a brilliant observation, and I would say this applies so much more broadly. I think most of adoption of conservation practices that we will see in the near term will be, at least in the American market and in either markets that are not supported by subsidies, i.e., everything else that's not Europe, will likely need to be paired with significant improvement in costs on the farm or a ranch. And this is particularly of interest because of that margin squeeze that we talked about on the high fuel prices, high input prices, but not growing market prices, maybe low or depressed market prices in some cases. Um, if the rancher or the farmer sees the opportunity, that's what they go for. In one of the programs that I'm happy to mention, Legacy Landscapes, Nestle Purina was the founding partner for it, and it's a very big tent approach. So other brands are joining, both on the manufacturing, on the retail side. It's fantastic to see folks come in to co-invest into a livestock system. It is a US range-based program, and it's with our partners at AgriWeb and National Grazing and Livestock Coalition. And what we're seeing is that the program is squarely presented as the farmer, as a rancher optimization opportunity to learn with experts, to implement something custom to their operation, to improve their budgets and how the ins and outs of it flow. Yes, genetics is a piece of it. Yes, feed is a piece of it. There's many other pieces of it, like the carbon sequestered in pastures. So this point that you're making is definitely applied more broadly. We're seeing the cropper is doing the same thing now that we have really felt the brunt of doing more passes on the field with diesel, um, doing more synthetic purchases of inputs. We are starting to be interested again in getting the farm off of that treadmill and getting it to maybe try to generate some of its own nutrition and limit the number of passes that the equipment needs to go through. So um, as you say, we can see this current situation as a huge headwind, but we could also see it as a tailwind for adoption if we can find the resources to support it.
So that equivalent to the Dust Bowl in terms of that shock to the system that, drove that behavioral change.
I believe so. Well, if maybe it doesn't need to be so drastic, but
We
even the
don't want it
episode
to.
in we don't want it to be drastic, but even the episode with Nebraska irrigation water restriction is being called kind of like a mini Dust Bowl moment. So I think any of these small episodes regionally on climate shocks are reminiscent of that original trouble that befell this place that led to engage in industry and the green revolution. And I think now we just have a different set of parameters to solve for. And my hope is that if we can align around the belief that conservation is profitable to everyone at the end, to policymakers, to government entities, to local communities, to farmers themselves, to consumers, then hopefully we'll be able to align on it being the priority.
How involved were you in the SAI agreement or declaration? Did you play a major role in that, or were you more sitting on the sidelines? And or if you can tell us that.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share that we were definitely on the sidelines of it. What I think Regrow has been doing is encouraging all of our partners to align on SAI, so that we have one standard. And we're very glad to see a significant cohort of partners join in, and we believe that there is more that that coalition could grow. It's a great example of needing the coalition to get the co-investment makes you believe that agreeing on the metrics of co-investment is an equally important part of the equation. So, said differently, if you have the shared outcomes you want to see, it's easier to co-invest together. And so that standard that establishes the shared outcomes is the SAI Regenerate Together. And largely, as we see it adopted in Europe, where that need for co-investment because of the greater rotation is even greater than elsewhere. But we're hoping that the international companies that have adopted this will distribute it everywhere else in the world. We're definitely seeing and have the capabilities to provide those metrics in other geographies. Primarily, it would be the Americas. And we see them being of interest in the Americas where those multinational organizations operate. And that might become one of the key, if not the key standard for this space that different MRVs can align to in the corporate reporting space. And those metrics are also valuable to the farmers. They're very readable. It's the things like what we talked about: nitrogen use efficiency, phosphorus use efficiency, irrigation efficiency. It's things that are looked at from the perspective of what can be of value to the farmer, not just of this abstract value to climate, which is a shared good, but it's really hard to relate to.
I think that goes back to what we've touched on quite a few times in terms of that value to the farmer, so that the economic and the value proposition is where the change is actually implemented. That person needs to be um, rewarded for their efforts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that reward, if there's an intrinsic motivation, if you see portion of your bill be reduced, if you see a greater paycheck, that is something that you can start reinvesting in your community, in your land, in your family.
And we're yet to discuss Oceania and Australia. So what's Regrow or Fluorosat, originally came from down that part of the world. So what's going on down there?
What's going on down there? What we're seeing is Australia operates according to its own national registry rules, and I think there is a growing interest in connecting with global supply chains. So we've definitely operated several programs like our partnership with Cargill locally in Australia and a couple other partners that are both part of that program and beyond. We've definitely seen that this private market driven insetting approach, if I may use some jargon here, effectively paying the farmers in your own value chain for the transition and acknowledging those outcomes in some way at a corporate level. We've definitely seen it be more rare because of the how isolated those supply chains are. Australia supplies as an exporter to a lot of countries in Asia. And in Asia, as I've mentioned, we're seeing this movement led by Japan and Singapore to accomplish their nationally determined contributions that they're committed to. And also, I can imagine, to also assure their supply chains. So there is a need for greater integration in that region. And it's connected a little bit to our conversation, how the US exporting into Asia is also struggling with that portion of the rotation. So, to be very direct, if you're growing a commodity that the off-taker is not interested in climate benefits, it's very hard to do anything with that part of the rotation, but you're still very financially motivated to grow it. So, if you grow beans, you're not going to stop growing beans because you need the nitrogen sequestration. Like you're definitely growing beans. Maybe you're growing more beans than you've ever grown with this current price of nitrogen. And maybe you're prioritizing that rotation, depending on what the market, of course, shows you. Because if the market is not motivating you, um, then you can't do anything about it. But with that part of the rotation not being of any value motivationally from the climate perspective to downstream players, that prevents you from additional investment. And so, as long as the feed to livestock supply chains that are connected to deep Asia are separate from this conservation movement in global agriculture that we're all trying to fund, there will be missing pieces that we have to work with. And I think Australia specifically has seen that as an exporter. Those are complicated systems. Japan can say, oh, I will buy into this program or into this program, but they're also importing a lot of the grains, partly from Australia through national systems. And I believe that those people are brilliant enough to integrate those nationally procured grains with climate contributions they want those grains to have. But it just hasn't happened yet.
It's interesting the Singapore example because it does make me reflect on what's happening in the Gulf, the UAEs and the Kuwaits and Qatar and those countries that their food security is hugely oil-rich countries whose food security is very dependent on a global abundance of traded food, so they can just buy it on the open market because they'll never be able to grow it locally.
Mhm.
Is there much of an appetite in that part of the world for like Singapore has engaged, or are they more using the similar approaches that they've used over the last 20 or 30 years?
I would say they're very engaged because of their understanding of the need for local supply chains to thrive, to continue to get access to them. I think right now it's just easier to do things through the offset market, which is effectively when the food and its climate impact are disjoint and where the investment can be made separately into the impact that the practice has compared to the commodity itself that is being produced. I would love to see more joint approach where the policy can bring those together. I think that will further spur the investment into conservation practices. And we see it that in more vertically integrated supply chains, it's a lot easier. It's traceable, you have fewer people to agree with, you can claim the impact a lot more directly. Let's look for a second on the fiber supply chain. We have not looked at it as much, but Australian cotton is pretty big in the global scene. It's a premium cotton. You, of course, have cotton growing everywhere else in the world, not only in Australia. But that supply chain is so disaggregated. You have so many steps of processing that it can be challenging to track the fiber to the garment for the brand to ultimately be able to say, this is regeneratively grown cotton. Some brands were able to achieve that, and that's fantastic. But this is where we see a need for them to form coalitions because they use shared manufacturing facilities, and so they need to be united front. But this is where you can see the more nodes in the supply chain, the more complexity that is. And I see that parallel directly with the Oceania Asian market, Australia as well, that if there is export, if there is product changing hands multiple times, if it's an open market, it's less predictable. You can't layer that level of contracting on top to say, sell me not just the product, but sell me the attribute as well. But there are other ways of doing it. They're just not the same. Like we talked about, there could be a procurement contract that someone can bid on and get that attribute paid for.
Anastasia, we're almost out of time. So before we go, is there anything you'd like to say that we haven't already covered?
No, I think we've gone in so many enriching places that I hope the audience listens to, engages with us, shares their thoughts that I also hope that me sharing the latest thinking, you sharing your latest thinking, will help them to advance in their thinking. And that's my hope for this hour.
It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you as always, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Ash Cloud. Please subscribe to Ash Cloud if you have enjoyed this podcast, where I will continue to discuss food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental, political and cultural challenges facing our society and creative ideas on how to address them.